Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have an incredible panel of experts with us who will share some of their firsthand perspectives on usage-based pricing, also known as consumption billing or variable pricing. This model has been around for a while, yet many companies are still navigating how to implement it effectively. Pricing strategy it's a critical driver of business growth and scalability, and it has influence in revenue recognition, cash flow, renewals, upsells, and even potentially customer churn. So with such a wide variety of potential models to choose from, understanding the opportunities and the trade-offs of each model is essential. So today we're fortunate enough to be joined by some experts who have analyzed and advised hundreds of companies on pricing and monetization strategies, and they'll share their unique perspectives and insights on usage-based pricing and billing, helping us to explore some of the best practices and the key considerations for success. Okay, so with that being said, we'll do some introductions here, and I'll start first. My name is Brad Mortimer. I'm our Vice President of Strategic Accounts here at Zone. My background is actually more in finance and accounting. I spent several years working in back office accounting, implementing ERP and billing solutions. I'm also an alumni of NetSuite. I worked at NetSuite for about 4 years as a solution consultant, worked with hundreds of companies evaluating ERP solutions, particularly in the SaaS and the technology space. And the last 6.5 years now, I've been at Zone and Company, helping companies automate billing and revenue recognition within NetSuite. But I'm joined by an amazing panel today: Ethan De Silva, Ira Gola, and Rob Litters. Just some bios of each individual here. So Ethan is Vice President at Insight Partners R&D Center of Excellence, where he leads the monetization strategy practice. Ethan has worked with over 250 SaaS businesses on their monetization strategy throughout his time at Insight and earlier in his career as an engagement manager at Simon Kucher and Partners. Ira is Vice President of Briegel Sagemont, where he leads their Offer Optimization Center of Excellence, focusing on product and pricing strategy. Throughout his consulting and private equity career, he has successfully driven strategic initiatives for over 25 companies, helping them achieve sustainable top and bottom line growth. His expertise spans topics in product strategy, pricing and packaging, sales, and finance. And then last, we also have Rob. Rob is the co-founder of Pricing SaaS and author of Good, Better, Best, a weekly newsletter that breaks down the latest trends and tactics in SaaS pricing. And Rob has spent over a decade in different capacities in SaaS, sales, marketing, and pricing strategy. So again, just thanks to all three of you guys for being here today, and looking forward to some of your thoughts and your insights. Okay, so we have an awesome lineup today. We're first going to start off with a quick little background of who Zone is for those in the audience that might not be familiar with us and how we work with customers. But then we're going to transition into the panelists, and we're going to get some of their insights into usage-based pricing and trends, and I have a lot of questions to ask them. We're then going to take the conversation a layer deeper, and we're going to introduce the 5 most common usage-based billing models that we see companies adopt. And we're going to talk about some of their implications that they might have on data, integrations, billing, revenue recognition, renewals and upsells and downsells, and how they impact potentially different areas of the business, hopefully giving the audience here some insights into how to navigate their own pricing strategies. We're then going to wrap up and tie everything together with talking about automation strategies. So we're going to talk about the complexities of usage-based billing, but then we'll tie that all together with the necessity of how to automate billing and revenue recognition to eliminate the accounting and finance team from potentially being a bottleneck when it comes to these models. And then lastly, given the amount of time we'll do some Q&A. Okay, so quick just background on Zone & Company. We are a company that provides native NetSuite solutions built for NetSuite. We wholeheartedly believe that NetSuite is the core system of record for general ledger, chart of accounts. It's all of your transactions. And we build solutions that expand the capability of NetSuite in potentially many different areas of the accounting operation. So that may be billing and revenue recognition, accounts payable, approvals, bank payments and reconciliation, reporting, and even payroll. We have over 4,000 customers globally, and we've been working within the NetSuite ecosystem for a little bit over a decade now. So moving on to the panelists here a little bit. Rob, I know I gave a background on you, but if you don't mind, maybe quick saying hello and just giving a little intro of yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brad. So I spent about 3 years at ProfitWell as a pricing strategist. And while I was there, I started a newsletter called Good, Better, Best. So I've been writing about pricing and packaging strategies in SaaS for about 5 years now. And 2 years ago, I met a technical partner who was building this database of SaaS pricing pages layered with scraping tools and AI. And for the last 2 years, we've basically been tracking over 3,000 SaaS pricing pages to try to identify trends, understand kind of where the market is going, and also identify like specific examples of companies that are doing really cool things with pricing and packaging. So that is Pricing SaaS, the kind of data company that we've been running. And now my newsletter kind of ladders up to that. And I think that's probably the most relevant part of my background for this webinar. I also lead a growth marketing team at HubSpot, have been in SaaS for about 12 years across sales and marketing. So a lot of experience there for sure.
Yeah, by the way, your website and the research that you've consolidated is amazing. And especially for someone like me, and incredibly useful. I think you're very unique in that you're one of the only people that I know that has consolidated the tracking and the reporting of this for thousands of companies at such a detailed level too that you provide on your website. So I guess my first question for you is, how have you seen the adoption of usage-based pricing evolve over the last 3 to 5 years?
Definitely. I think when I was at ProfitWell, which I left ProfitWell in 2021, but I know usage-based pricing was gaining a ton of steam. I think people saw the success of Snowflake and other companies who were consumption driven and really wanted to move in that direction. And I think anytime I started with a new client, the first thing that they said is that they wanted to reevaluate their value metric and see if they could just push fully towards consumption. The biggest thing that I think I've noticed over the last 3 to 5 years is just that that's kind of been reconciled a little bit, and people have kind of been pressure tested and kind of pressure checked on ongoing full consumption. I think like the two trends that I've seen most frequently that I expect we'll talk about a lot today, especially after that poll, are hybrid models. Like I think hybrid models have become more popular than ever. And that's a huge part of kind of my background in pricing. I sold a hybrid model at HubSpot and believe really strongly in them being a super effective way to package your SaaS. And then also kind of prepaid credit models have become more popular too. And so I think those are ways that people are implementing usage, but within a context where, it can't kind of run away from the customer. It doesn't scare the customer with unexpected bills.
Yeah, both of those models, of which we're going to dive into in a little bit here. And I would say, just to kind of follow or add to that, some of the trends that I've seen in the adoption of usage-based billing is, you can go back, a decade or so, and the only information you potentially had on your customer was whether or not they logged into your tool or not. But today you have much more data of not only how if they're logging in, but how they're actually using your tool, right? And that's where the adoption or usage-based pricing has come in to say, what are they downloading? What are they clicking? What are they using the most? And how can we monetize, some of that data? So my second question I have for you is, are there any recent innovations or trends that you've seen in usage billing technology that you find particularly impactful?
Yeah, I think over the last like 3 years, I've noticed just a huge uptick in the number of startups in this space. Like when I was at Profitwell, I don't really remember there being any usage-based billing solutions, period. Like I think that was like a completely nascent space. And now you have Zone and Co, what you guys are doing with NetSuite, obviously. You have Orb, Metronome, Meter, you have Stripe getting into the game with Stripe billing. You have all of these solutions. They're trying to tackle it from different angles. And I think it's going to be really interesting. I think like what's going to end up happening is there are going to be companies that kind of tackle different parts of the market and different kind of aspects of pricing, right? Like I think there are certain solutions that are going to integrate pricing and product and kind of the engineering side, and then other solutions that are going to be talking more to the finance side. And then I think, there are like product there are product platforms out there right now like LaunchDarkly and StatSig and stuff like that that are feature flagging platforms and can also kind of contribute to pricing and packaging. So I think the space is getting a lot more crowded, a lot more interesting, and there are a lot of ways to go about it. But I think one of the first components to a usage-based pricing strategy is you actually have to be able to measure the usage in the right way. So I think it's super important, and I'm super excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think in the billing, technology space, there'll never be a one size fits all, right? I mean, there's going to be B2B models, there's going to be B2C models, and there's different, solutions that are better fit for those business models for sure. Um, awesome, Rob. We're definitely going to come back to you, but appreciate that. Moving on to Ira. Ira, if you don't mind, maybe quick saying hello and doing a little bit of background.
Yeah, great to meet, or I guess maybe see everybody. Ira Golub, a lot like Ethan, I started my career at Simon Kucher and Partners. I think if you're in the pricing world and you shake a tree, 10 SKPers fall out. But I moved over to the private equity space for the past couple of years. I've been largely holding commercial facing roles. Most of my experience is in the software space, currently at SageMount, which invests in lower middle market and middle market technology companies, but also have a little bit of a background in industrials, healthcare. I've seen a couple of things. So Brad, as you mentioned, I lead our offer optimization pillar, and just kind of given my background in pricing, a lot of our pricing and packaging work kind of falls on my desk within the portfolio.
Awesome. And I was actually fortunate enough to be in attendance at the Regal Sagemont conference that you guys did in Santa Monica. And the title of the event there was called The Big Exit, right? And I think especially for private equity backed companies, that's what's on the mind of these founders and executives is how do I grow my business and achieve the highest possible multiplier for a potential big exit? And there's obviously many contributing factors to that, which I think you guys presented on beautifully at the event. But I also believe pricing and billing play a critical role in that. So I guess the question I have for you is, how do investors view usage-based pricing models versus maybe traditional subscription models when you're assessing a company's growth potential?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest things to look out for can be divided up into current customers, new customers, and then let's call it like macro. So on a current customer basis, the big indicator is really net retention, gross retention becoming one of the most important valuation metrics. As companies advance more towards profitability, it's how can you ensure that a usage-based model is unlocking growth amongst your current customer base? So what do those upsells, downsells look like? It is super, super important from an investor lens as they're trying to model out what the next couple of years are going to look like. To that end as well, on the new customer side, thinking about new logo velocity, how much of a usage-based model or how many changes can you make to your model that would enable, an increase in logo velocity? What are those implications on your business if you can go grab more market and so on? And then on a macro level, more on the downside, what are the risks? So an example here is a business in the auto industry charging on auto claims in a world that's moving more towards autonomous vehicles is a macro risk that's going to get flagged in an investment committee. So you want to be considerate of, how usage-based or how variable your model is and how maybe macro headwinds could effectuate changes down the line. So I would say those are probably the three biggest factors in each of the metrics that are tied to them that really top of mind, when we're doing diligence on a new company, a new platform, or we're considering new businesses.
Yeah, you started to touch on this. You mentioned net retention and growth retention as being critical metrics to measure, especially for usage-based companies. Could you just expand upon that, or what other financial metrics do you monitor for companies who do have usage-based pricing?
Yeah, I would say net and gross retention are probably the biggest two. So just on a pure dollar basis, how much of that revenue bucket are you able to retain of those that are leaving? So that's going to be an indicator of basically what you have to replace every year. You can think about gross retention as kind of your bucket that's left over. So if you were running a 90% gross retention, it means you start the year in a 10% hole. And that's where you get to that new logo velocity versus net retention. It's how are you going to fill that hole from current customers? So how are you going to enable a usage-based model to upsell those customers to let them grow deeper with you and so on? Or how are you going to go out and get new customers to hit whatever that exponential curve is you're looking to hit 10, 20, 50, 100% growth, hopefully 100% growth for everybody that's on the phone. anymore.
Awesome. Thank you, Ira. I'm going to move on to Ethan here. Ethan, you as well, if you don't mind, maybe just quick saying hello and doing a little background.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So similar to the Ira, right? I started Atomic Christian Partners. I like to think of myself as a reform consultant. Sort of learned a lot of good methodology and how to approach, problem solving. But I think, I took what I learned there and really applied an 80-20 version to my work with portfolio companies within Insight. And so I work with, portfolio companies of all shapes and sizes, from some of our earlier companies to some of our more mature ones on redesigning product and monetization strategy, really as they launch new products, touch new market, and then their value proposition expands.
Ethan, I'm glad that you were able to join this because Zone and Company we're a fellow Insight, we're Insight portfolio company. We've had the privilege of working with you directly on, as we ourselves are strategizing on our pricing and our packaging. So my question for you is, what are the biggest opportunities that usage billing presents for SaaS companies in 2025 and potentially beyond?
Yeah. Two things come to mind. The first is a little bit more generic in terms of just really enabling land and expand. And the second one is our relatively newer one, which is monetizing Gen AI functionality. On that first one, I think it really simply put is that, you're reducing barriers to adoption. I think I kind of touched on that, and then driving revenue expansion growth as the value deliverer grows to your customers. I think, looking at the past year or so, there's several companies that I've worked with in the Insight portfolio that didn't start out with usage-based models, but their product portfolio and value proposition evolved to a point where it was very compelling to transition to a usage-based pricing model. And I think the learning there is to constantly be evaluating whether your ability to monetize and grow your business scales with how you deliver value. The second one, in terms of monetizing Gen AI functionality, I think, my experience working with several portfolio companies the last year, and they see that, Gen AI definitely creates an opportunity to leverage usage-based pricing. But, if you aren't thoughtful in terms of how you get there, it could potentially be in that negative in the short term. One portfolio company comes to mind that launched several agents in the second half of last year. And we're looking to aggressively monetize those agents on usage-based pricing, like a lot of companies. And we did a lot of primary research, talked to customers, talked to the sellers, and just did a diagnostic of what their systems look like. And it was very clear that the customers lacked a mental model of how to ascribe value to these agents. And, usage-based billing could be potentially scary to them for something that is very variable for their cost. And the other side of it, they definitely did not have the capability to reliably rate, meter, and bill at scale. And so because of that, we made a decision that, 2025, we're going to take a more conservative approach, prioritize adoption, and charge, or monetize primarily the platform piece. There's more really, the hybrid subscription model, and buy ourselves time, build a mental model of value from a customer perspective, work on how we pitch, and build systems up so that in 2026, we can launch a more credit-based model, more, complex model, where I think finally customers and systems have caught up to enable that. So the takeaway there is really consider a crawl, walk, run approach to monetizing Gen AI from a usage-based perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. So I think, what I'm hearing is obviously there's a boom and an adoption of Gen AI across, companies' products. Obviously, companies like OpenAI, their model is actually usage-based, right? They build based on tokens and things like that, which may seem like an obvious way to then also kind of build your own customers in a usage-based model. But I think what you're saying is that, hey, that might not be the obvious choice, and you should probably take a little bit more of a crawl, walk, run approach as it comes to monetizing your potentially new Gen AI features. My second question I have is, what are the common pitfalls that SaaS companies encounter with usage-based pricing models?
Yeah, I think it's really tied to the point you just made, in that just because you can charge, two things there again, but the first one is just because you can charge per usage doesn't mean you should. You mentioned it, everyone thinks about usage-based because of that's how their costs are scaling with, OpenAI or whatever large language model they're using. I think Rob brought up Snowflake, right? I think 6-7 years ago when I was the price consultant, And Snowflake really came to the forefront of everyone's mind that, oh, wow, look at that. And that with revenue retention and how fast they're growing. So sitting on the board ratings, a lot of CEOs are coming up and saying, hey, we want Snowflake model. And the simple question we would ask them is, do you have a Snowflake value proposition? Or, obviously not in structure, but is your value still like that? And I think, the reality is that your customers don't ascribe value to the usage metric, then you shouldn't charge that way. And so I think I had this conversation honestly monthly where a company looked, hey, we have this usage metric, can we charge on it? Well, we need to do the primary research. You need to think about what customers value before really going full throttle down that path. The second pitfall that comes to mind as well is really just underestimating the systems and go-to-market change management necessary for success. I already mentioned, it takes time to develop a system to meter, rate, bill at scale, but it also takes time to build a system to surface usage to customers and to your customer success team, and so that it makes that like they understand what they're consuming and how that adds value to them. On the go-to-market side, I think it can be a very significant change depending on the proportion of revenue that is going to become driven by usage-based pricing, right? So everything from sales enablement to sales comm, financial forecasting, onboarding, potentially needs to be revisited and reconfigured to support that model. But it's very dependent on the model that you go with.
Yeah. Yeah. What might seem like an amazing go-to-market strategy and pricing that's going to drive user adoption, it could also be operationally, if you don't have the operation side of it down, right, you're going to fail at it, right? From the quoting to a billing to a collections to revenue recognition, there's a whole systems and operations side of this process as well, which we're going to dive into as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the most common usage-based billing models that we see. Now, I've been working with companies now for a decade, and so has everybody here on the panel. I'm never surprised when I see a new billing model, right? I mean, companies and people are getting more and more creative with how they want to monetize their product, but these are the 5 most common that we see, or at least flavors of these models. And what I'd like to do is go in depth on each one of these a little bit and maybe uncover some of their challenges or the implications that these models might have on things like billing and cash flow and revenue recognition and customer adoption and renewals and churn. So we'll start with the first one being pay as you go, which is probably the most simple of all of those, where customers are charged based on the actual usage of their product or service. The most common model is you're billed monthly in arrears for the level of consumption that you had. It's a very simple rate times quantity equals amount, typical calculation here. So Rob, I have a question for you on this one. What would you say are the key advantages and challenges of adopting a pay-as-you-go model for SaaS companies?
Yeah, I think pay-as-you-go, the variability of it kind of cuts both ways. I think the benefit of pay-as-you-go is basically anybody can start using your SaaS product, right? So you can open it up to pretty much any customers to try to check it out and see if they get value out of it. On the opposite side of that, it's really hard to predict the revenue. We have a lot of people using it and a really large team kind of getting after it in the software. And so I think a pay-as-you-go is like a great way to drive acquisition. I think, you see a decent amount of kind of like low-end tiers that are kind of like the next step up from like a freemium tier. And freemium is actually getting more and more rare from my experiences and what I've been seeing. But I think you see a lot of pay-as-you-go as kind of like that second tier and first paid tier to allow people to ramp up into sort of products.
Yeah, I think when I look at pay-as-you-go, I kind of look at it as it was the original. When usage-based billing model first became a thing, this was the first model that everybody was adopting. And in some ways, pay-as-you-go is the foundation for models 2 through 5 here, right? If you're not operationally capable of billing or pricing on a pay-as-you-go model, you probably aren't ready to navigate the additional complexities that come with 2 through 5 on this screen. And I think, you kind of touched on it too. I think one of the beautiful things about the simplicity of pay-as-you-go is that it's perceived as fair and transparent, right? And it's a great way to adopt customer adoption, right? Hey, just get on, start using it, and pay for what you use. But unfortunately, what comes with that is high unpredictability, right? Just as fast as any large company could scale on usage-based pricing or pay-as-you-go pricing, customers can also immediately stop, right? So what you typically sometimes unfortunately see is these peaks and valleys, maybe potentially when it comes to revenue recognition or just revenue reporting in general, which is what leads me to the billing model number two, which is layering on this component of minimum commitments. And minimum commitments is in some ways, I think, trying to combat the unpredictability of pay as you go. So minimum commitments, just in terms of definition, is where customers commit to a baseline of usage billing. And no matter what, they're going to get billed that minimum, even if they're under it. If and when they hit that minimum, they then may incur potentially some overage fees. So my question here, Ethan, how do businesses effectively balance setting minimum commitments to ensure predictable revenue, but also managing the risk of customers being dissatisfied with potentially expensive overage charges?
Yeah, candidly, this is not my favorite model, but there's almost an expectation of overages, and people just generally need overages. That being said, I think where I've seen minimum sets usually dependent on two things. One, with the minimum contract size the sales team is willing or should be selling. And the second is using historical usage patterns to inform, what would be, a reasonable amount of each to consume within a term. I think using the overages primarily as a way to keep customers honest on that initial commitment is usually how I've seen it work better, and also not to enforce overages in that contract term to penalize customers for using and valuing your product. I think there's obviously a lot of different ways where you can deal with overages, chewing them forward and baking their growth into the next contract term. It's a much more customer-friendly approach that I like to suggest to portfolio companies.
Yeah, I often see companies combining this minimum commitment plus overage with potentially the introduction of tiers, right? So rather than incurring expensive overage charges, maybe it's actually more economical to upgrade to a higher level of tier with potentially a higher commitment level, but more advantageous pricing, right? Rather than incurring these potentially overage charges.
Okay, on that too, where we've seen value in our portfolio is actually combining concepts from both of those first two. Having a pay-as-you-go tier paired with kind of the model you just described, Brad, is a really good way to hit on both of the pros that Ethan and Rob just defined. I wanted to add some value to this conversation as long as I'm here.
No, I appreciate you. We want to provide a growth path for our customers, right? Easy way to adopt, but also grow and scale on the platform by kind of combining a transition into the minimum commit model here. The third model here that we're going to talk about is prepaid, which sometimes in some ways blends with minimum commitment. But I think the major difference here with prepaid is that, a customer is prepaying in advance, either by putting a large deposit down or potentially, Rob, that you mentioned earlier, buying these credits, and then they consume those credits at their own discretion over time. A great example here, I think most people can relate to is this, well, maybe in the Northeast at least, for those of us who use Easy Pass, right? You load your account with the dollar value in Easy Pass, you're going to drive on the highways and you're going to deplete your Easy Pass balance. And at some point, you're going to need to replenish that balance. You're going to need to top it off, right? There comes a ton of complexities here, which I'll touch on with, as relating to revenue recognitions, specifically in ASC 606. But Ira, this question is for you. So one of the complexities about this prepaid model is the unused balances in prepaid models. And sometimes it can create these discrepancies and lead to potentially customers dissatisfied when they're left with these unused balances in their account. So what strategies can businesses use to minimize these disputes and then maintain strong customer relationships while managing these unused balances?
Yeah, I'd say from my perspective, like rules is kind of the name of the game in a prepaid drawdown type of scenario. So it's not only the rules upon rollover or unused credits, but it's also the rules upon replenishment. So are you in an auto replenish type of scenario? What are the communications that are coming from, whether it be your sales team, customer success, et cetera, that's creating that replenishment motion. So there is a load of complexity that is added to this model on just how you structure it, where there's flexibility, where there might not be so much flexibility. To the CFOs that are on the call, like credit breakage is a real thing, and it's something that can be advantageous, on a P&L per se, but it's something you definitely should watch out for from a customer satisfaction perspective. So one of the pros to a model like this is that you'll naturally see some level of breakage somewhere. It all comes down to how you handle it and basically how you contract out with customers to define what's fair game versus what's not.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. Rules, rules, rules. You got to define the rules for use it or lose it, rollover, replenishment, because all of those things, again, my mind goes to accounting, has so many implications on revenue recognition, deferred revenue, and just reporting in general.
And even furthermore to that note on valuation, this is probably, of all of these models, minus obviously pay as you go, is probably going to be reviewed as the least recurring revenue esque of the group. So that's an important consideration as you're looking at, whatever multiple anybody would get on your revenue. It's going to be looked at as very transactional in nature.
Yeah, from a cash flow perspective, it's great, right? Because you get all the cash up front. But agreed on the recurring nature of it. The fourth one, hybrid model. So hybrid models, I think, combines the best of a little bit of both of these, right? Oftentimes you see fixed recurring platform fees that include a lot of functionality from a fixed recurring perspective, while also layering on usage-based billing, for hopefully value-added, things within your product. So Rob, my question for you is what makes this model so attractive and how can SaaS companies strike the right balance in a hybrid model?
Yeah, I think I was spoiled with this because my first experience in SaaS was at HubSpot, which I think did a really, really good job of using a hybrid model. It's cited a lot in pricing literature for the marketing suite, which is what I was selling back in the day. And basically, they had a 3-part tariff model where they had a base fee that included a certain level of contacts, which also equated to a certain number of emails per month. And then that number in the base would go up with each tier, and then there'd be a variable fee for additional contacts for each of those plans. And between each of those plans, there was always a point where it made more economic sense just to upgrade because the variable number of contacts you would be adding would end up costing you more than just upgrading to the next plan. And so I thought that was super smart. What it also did for us on the sales side is it really allowed us to be consultative as sellers in HubSpot. And I think this was particularly important at HubSpot because we were kind of like trying to teach people how to rethink marketing, right? Like we were trying to help them understand marketing automation and inbound marketing. And we could kind of help them understand, well, here's where you are now as far as like contacts in your database. Here's where we think you're going to go based on your existing growth and what we can help you do at HubSpot. And because of that, like, here's where we actually think you should start. We can discount you back to kind of like your current contact levels. Like we could play some games from like a negotiation standpoint if we had that kind of subjectivity within the pricing model to make those kind of decisions. And you just don't have that with like a pure consumption model or a flat fee. The other thing is like, I think with hybrid, ideally you're charging for a metric that your product is going to help increase or solve for, right? So like with HubSpot, we really wanted to help our customers grow their contact database, right? So the idea down the road is like, well, yeah, you're going to be paying us more because you're going to have more contacts, but hopefully those contacts are going to end up as more opportunities and ultimately more customers down the road. So I think those are some of the benefits. On the customer side, I think it also makes it more predictable as well. And if you're really thoughtful about those limits for usage and you kind of like match them with what you're seeing in your database, then you're going to avoid a lot of kind of disputes with customers or angry customers by moving in this direction.
It's super interesting to hear your experience there with HubSpot too. And it sounds like this model, provides potentially sales and go to market with a little bit more flexibility when it comes to trying to, negotiate with customers and drive value.
Yeah. The one thing I would add is after I left HubSpot, I went to another company that started on a fixed fee and tried to reverse engineer a hybrid model where basically we were going into the install base and telling people that were paying like $50 a month that they'd be paying $500 to $1,000 a month. And that didn't go over as well as the HubSpot sales conversation. So just be careful with it. And I would say try to start early with hybrid if you can.
The last one here is really probably the simplest, right? In some ways, it's calling it a usage-based model, but the definition of it is it's not usage, it's unlimited usage. And Ira, I have the question for you here. So unlimited usage models can be appealing to customers because who doesn't love the word unlimited, right? But it also could pose risks to profitability where costs have a potential to increase while revenue might stay flat, right? So in what scenarios is this model a good fit, and how should companies strategically position unlimited models?
Yeah, I would say my word of advice here is never base your price off of costs. You always want to be value based in your pricing, but always consider costs when setting your pricing. So cost to serve is a super, super important consideration, especially if you're running a higher cost of sales. Just making sure that you are, meeting a reasonable gross margin or a profitable gross margin that's going to flow down and make the rest of your business profitable. So you always have to ensure that in some way, if you're running with a flat model, I think we talked about ChatGPT earlier, which in their B2B segment, they're running, a more variable approach. In their consumer segment, I think Sam Altman came out and said Pro or Plus or one of the flat fee consumer accesses wasn't profitable. So an example of a consideration where you need to make sure that your cost to serve can match up with whatever you're pricing. I would say the second side of this is, and I think Ethan covered this point as well, make sure you're talking to customers. So an example of like a Netflix is that Netflix probably shouldn't consider billing per show, or per episode. So make sure that you've got that value metric right. Like you're nailing the metric that you're scaling on. A lot of companies are moving away from flat fee because everybody started at flat fee. It doesn't necessarily mean that flat fee is a bad alternative. You just need to be considerate of where specific company's value proposition fits in and how customers interpret the value as it scales.
Amazing. Thank you, all three of you guys, for all that insight and answering some of these questions. Just to summarize a little bit. So we've talked a lot about the benefits and the challenges with different pricing models and about their potential impacts that each of these models have on data, calculations, revenue recognition, billing. And unfortunately, what I've seen far too often is that accounting becomes the bottleneck, for businesses and go-to-market teams who want to adopt a model that they believe is going to grow customer acquisition and provide a scalable monetization strategy. And the last thing that the CFO or the office of the CFO wants to be is a bottleneck that hinders the organization's ability to grow. And that's why it's so important to implement the right tools to automate some of these processes and also provide the agility to adapt as the business changes. Because we know this is not the first time pricing is going to change, and it's not the last. And this is where zone billing has been immensely successful. Zone billing is built entirely inside the walls of NetSuite. So that's your core system of record for financial transactions, your general ledger, your chart of accounts. And it's where your team typically lives on a day-to-day basis. And we layer on that sophistication of billing and subscription management, essentially transforming NetSuite ERP from just an ERP system into a billing and revenue platform that's capable of automating the full life cycle of quote to cash. Okay, we are already up on time. So unfortunately, we don't have time for the Q&A. But I just want to thank a huge thanks to the panelists, Ira, Ethan, and Rob for joining and providing some of the insights. And thanks everybody else for joining as well. And have a good rest of your day.